minutes late. It's a great pleasure, it's a great honor to begin today with not the last, it's the penultimate Jean-Marie module and at the same time academic forum of the Graduate School of Government and European Studies. The purpose of the academic forum that we have here is to discuss from the scholarly perspective the issues that arise in Slovenia and beyond, usually and hopefully with the guest speakers who do not work, who are not faculty members of the Graduate School of Government and European Studies. It is to bring sort of a fresh blood into the system, as it were. So first of all, I have to acknowledge the generous support that we got from the European Commission for this event and for the generous presence of our three speakers today. Let me start with the gentleman on my left-hand side, Dimitri Kosheno. Dimitri is a professor and chair of European law at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He's one of the most prolific young European lawyers that I know. He's written on an enormous amount of subjects. He's written about them well, critically, and in an engaged way. And I'm really thankful, Dimitri, that you're here today. In a way, again, you participated in our conference a year ago, so I really do consider him as a friend of this institution. Then, and also as a friend of mine. Then, next to him is Nea Penza. She's an assistant at the Graduate School of Government and European Studies, but at the moment she's just finishing her PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. She's one of the promising legal and beyond legal scholar in Slovenia, working in the field of environmental transnational law, but also broadly involved in the working and in the activities of the Slovenian civil society. She's also a member of the initiative, the European Slovenia, that is also co-organizing the event today. So Nea, thank you very much for coming. And finally, Anže Logar. Anže wears a number of hats, though none today. But Anže is today invited, first of all, as alumnus of this school, and foremost as a candidate to the European Parliament on the EPP ticket. So the interest has been disclosed. He's supposed to be politically biased, and he's invited precisely. He's invited precisely so to hear from somebody who's running into for the elections into the European Parliament, to see his perspective on the democratic process in Europe as well as in Slovenia in that direction. So I think we have an excellent panel, and since I've been talking too much, we should get started immediately. The idea is that each of the panelists will talk briefly for 5 to 7, maybe 10 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for the discussion. But before I give them the floor, I decided to show you 3 clips to put this debate today into a context. The title of the debate of the academic forum, of the roundtable, I think is the enlargement 10 years on, the questions of rule of law, the questions of democracy and the Europeanization. And I've chosen today 3 clips that it will be short, for 3 to 5 minutes, that will somehow contextualize this, and I think we should just run them to, and I hopefully we will be able to hear and see something.
We must all turn our backs upon the horrors of the past. We must look to the future. We must build a kind of United States of Europe.
Bénéficier du prix Nobel de la paix, c'est être investi d'une mission, c'est-à-dire de véhiculer la paix, les idées de paix partout où c'est possible.
L'Europe n'a pas été faite. Nous avons eu la guerre. L'Europe ne se fera pas d'un coup. Elle se fera par des réalisations concrètes.
Es würde mich persönlich sehr berühren, wenn Europas Schaden zugefügt würde in dieser kritischen Zeit. Wir haben Probleme, aber wir halten trotzdem dran fest, weil es ist ein sehr, sehr großer Wert und das bedeutet für mich dieser Preis.
Pourquoi est-ce qu'en réalité nous avons voulu faire l'Europe au lendemain de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale?
Kraje w latach I wojny światowej, II wojny światowej walczyły między sobą, prowadziły bardzo zacięte konflikty zbrojne, a teraz jest to po prostu niemożliwe. Jeśli ja miałbym wziąć do zagrabin i walczyć w ogóle z Francji czy z Niemiec, to jest po prostu niewyobrażalne.
Ce premier marché commun, ces premières institutions supranationales, c'est l'Europe qui commence à s'unir.
Este Premio Nobel de la Paz actúa como un factor cohesionador en tiempos en que la economía podría significar guerras económicas.
Mais tout de même, retournez-vous un peu. Demandez-vous ce que l'Europe était encore il y a 50 ans.
En ce moment, la solidarité est peut-être un peu mise à rude épreuve, mais du coup, oui, c'est vrai que c'est peut-être bien de se rappeler que nous, contrairement à nos parents ou grands-parents, n'avons pas connu de guerre.
Nur mit einem starken, einigen Europa können wir Europäer und kann die Welt wirklich gedeihen.
Seitdem die Mauer gefallen ist, habe ich das Gefühl, endlich zur rechten Zeit zu leben. Denn der Mauerbau war für mich der eigentliche Einschnitt im Leben.
Warmly welcome to our family. Our new Europe is born.
L'Europe, elle n'est pas faite pour nous, elle est faite pour tous les pays européens. Ouvrir nos bras à ces pays, c'était formidable, c'était notre cœur qui parlait.
Możemy normalnie żyć, nie musimy się niczego obawiać. Możemy poznawać świat.
Le 1er mai 2004, j'étais avec tous ceux qui étaient émus là, parce que c'était un moment symbolique, notre retour dans la communauté des peuples, où la peur devait trouver sa place.
Czuję się z tego dumna i bardzo bym chciała, żeby wszyscy młodzi ludzie, ale nie tylko młodzi, żeby wszyscy obywatele Polski czuli się tak samo dumni jak ja.
Ako kažete da s 30 godina i čovjek dijete koje preživo rat, još nisam učio Europu i želim da obiđu, da budem građanin, da vidim kako to ljudi žive, ne moram da raditi, tamo znači sam ta osjećaj da budu neki izazov.
We have today been able to give a very clear message to the Western governments. They will become part of our family.
Sad prije svega ja sam bila dijete. Ja sam jako mlada, izgubila sam svoju majku. Pa dobro, neke stvari se nikad ne mogu zaboraviti. Ali trebamo gledati naprijed zbog naše djece, zbog čisto zbog Bosne i Hercegovine, zbog budućnosti Bosne i Hercegovine.
On ne reverra jamais assez à quel point cette paix, désormais si enracinée, a constitué une révolution par rapport à une histoire émaillée au fil des siècles, de conflits incessants, dramatiques, sanglants.
Ich kann nur sagen, weiterkämpfen dafür mit friedlichen Mitteln, dass Europa vereinigt bleibt. Ich liebe Europa.
So now I'm just going to run the next clip. I'm not going to comment on them. I'm not going to disclose why I chose them. It's for our event.
It may have escaped much international attention, but the nation of Hungary appears on a dangerous path. Critics accuse the ruling Fidesz party there of undermining democracy, making constitutional changes more suited to an authoritarian regime than a member of the European Union.
This process started 1.5 years ago, when the current government got into power, and since then they are systematically dismounting checks and balances and independent institutions. Recently, there was a bill introduced in the parliament to curb the independence of the central bank that was most alarming.
It's that concern in financial markets that's brought the issue of Hungary to the fore. The European Union and IMF are refusing to bail out its heavily indebted economy. Ratings agencies have stripped Hungary of its investment grade status. And wider concerns are spilling out onto the streets. The Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is accused of tightening his grip on power by redrawing election boundaries, installing loyal judges in the country's courts, and curbing media freedom. The government says it's nearly following through on its election promises to sweep away the old order.
Well, there's a visible and very well orchestrated effort actually on behalf of the opposition parties to put together this kind of democracy deficit problem in the last couple of months. And we have to deal with those major economic and social problems that the previous two socialist governments have created. So we are basically finishing in about a year and a half, as I told, a kind of process that should have been started 20 years ago.
Observers warn Hungary's democracy seems increasingly fragile, and that authoritarianism in the heart of Europe may be on the rise. Matthew Chance, CNN London.
And even if the judgment is reversed, in the end, no judge will have to answer for that. In March 2013, violent protests organised by the Forum 21 and speculations of two smaller political parties brought down the second SDS government. After that, the Slovenian transitional political left finally dropped their mask. In April 2013, they gathered at a big event in the sports hall Stožice and loudly sang the old anthem of the communists, Internazionale Bandiera Rossa. And the new hit song of the Slovenian transitional political left, Europe is a gang of thieves. At the event that was attended by the President of the Republic, Prime Minister with a number of ministers, the President of the Constitutional Court, and the President of the Forum 21, the flags were flown with the communist red star, hammer and sickle, and the event was broadcasted by state television. There was not one national flag flown there, let alone a European one. The EU development funds were used to restore the monument dedicated to the former Yugoslav communist dictator Tito. In schools, they have begun to dress children in pioneer uniforms and pushed into their hands the wooden rifles. At the events funded by the government and celebrating the totalitarian past, so dressed children stand together with communist paramilitary units which are dressed in the old Titoist uniforms and with weapons in their hands. Europe does not notice that, even though these kinds of events in the last months became mass phenomena and present no longer an individual excess. Parading of uniformed but unarmed extreme right-wing formations in Budapest encounters an immediate condemnation of the government of Hungary and the European press. Yet parading of uniformed extreme left-wing Titoist units with weapons in Slovenia are supported by government money. And Europe does not notice it, although Slovenian national television almost weekly plays a video recording from such events, where children are abused and songs like "Europe is a gang of thieves" are sang while the restoration of democratic socialism is requested. In 1996, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a special resolution on measures to dismantle the heritage of former communist totalitarian systems. Resolution in the third paragraph draws attention also to the consequences of unsuccessful transition, and it says, the dangers of a failed transition process are manifold, that and that oligarchy will reign instead of democracy, corruption instead of rule of law, and organized crime instead of human rights. At worst, the result could be the velvet restoration of a totalitarian regime, if not a violent overthrow of the fledgling democracy. When this resolution was being drafted in 1995 and 1996, its drafters almost certainly did not pay much attention to Slovenia, which, until 2009, at least from the outside, was considered a success story in the group of post-communist countries. However, under this guise, a different true image was hiding. Socialist majority in the Slovenian parliament in 1997 voted against this resolution and flatly refused it. This was followed by some equally unsuccessful proposals by the opposition, until in 2009 the Slovenian parliament also rejected the European Parliament's resolution on European conscience and totalitarianism because it also mentioned communism. This vote further testified that the transitional process in Slovenia, to a large extent, has not been successful, and that the old structures have been largely restored within the new institutions, while in some spheres, especially the judiciary, there were no serious changes at all. The final consequence is deep political and economic crisis in the country, with even worse prognosis made by the European Commission and the IMF for 2014 and 2015, putting Slovenia at the last place among all 28 members of the European Union.
Okay, so these are three images of the European Union as it stands or as it stood in 2012, 2013, 2014. Of course, they're all interpretations. It might be called propaganda. But my question is to you, maybe to start with you, Dimitri. What do you make of it? How do you connect this to the idea of the rule of law, democracy in Europe? These three images.
This is a wonderful question. But I actually prepared something that can probably connect the three a little bit. Because I think Europe is at the crossroads as we witness the dismantling of democracies in a number of places. So it's time to move beyond the ideology, as it were, in order to ensure that Europe actually functions. And by Europe, I mean both the European Union and the member states together. So the European Union should encourage the member states to act in accordance with what they pledged to act by when they join the Union, and should also get the tools to ensure that this kind of functioning of the member states is possible. The first clip was profoundly disturbing. I'm not against the Nobel Prize Committee. If I were American, I would also vote for Obama. But this kind of presentation of Europe is something that has nothing to do with reality whatsoever, because it misrepresents the world and it basically speaks into the heart of our history. That instead of representing the world as divided, bipolar, and profound antagonized system of conflicting parts, one led by the Soviet Union, another by the United States, it puts Europe at peace in the center of the story, forgetting about the Cold War and forgetting about the Berlin Wall. So basically that clip is about one half of Europe where Americans guarded their particular idea of peace against another idea of peace which was guarded on the other side. So the European Union actually has not done anything whatsoever in order to foster peace. And this kind of videos are profoundly misleading. It's great to unify Europe, of course, but we shouldn't send misleading messages which actually undermine the achievements of the Union in plenty of other spheres. In fact, if we look at peace as a value, the European Union did not define it and absolutely failed to promote it even in the nearest abroad, as it were. So European Union, to me, is also Srebrenica. It's also what's going on now in Ukraine. It's total incapacity, inability, and programmed failure in coping with the challenges of the day. It has been like this from day one. If not American troops, if not help from across the ocean, Europe would be totally different. It would be one of the provinces of the Soviet Union, and we should very well realize that. Instead of praising the Nobel Committee for honoring this elusive needs of the Union, which was created with much help from across the ocean. Let's put it that way. No problem with that, once again. But now the challenge is to deal with the values seriously. And what did you do with the values? First, you define them. We have Article 2 in the Treaty on the European Union that lists the values, but the values have never been elaborated on. This piece is something that is basically empty words if you know history. All the others, the rule of law, democracy, human rights protection, etc. We know how human rights appear in the EU, with companies as the starting point. We know what the rule of law is at the EU level, mostly legality. We know the input of other organizations, such as the Council of Europe, which have been crucial. Again, nothing problematic with that. But the European Union has never defined what it stands for. Moreover, it has actually diluted its understanding of values to a great extent by claiming through the European neighborhood policy that actually it shares its values with plenty of countries of the neighborhood. So it will be a surprise for you to know, well, not a surprise for the Commission, that we share the values with Azerbaijan, we share the values with the Moldova Republic, we share the values with the Palestinian Authority. This kind of empty talk actually undermines our serious treatment of what the Union stands for. So the values are not elaborated. The second point, the values are not professed. You need to live by your values if you take them seriously. You haven't elaborated on them, but probably they will kind of emerge in the process. What is the European Union famous for? A democratic deficit, inability to steer the member states like Hungary to compliance, and unwillingness to step beyond the internal market thinking. So in fact, the whole legal structure of the European Union is profoundly problematic from the point of view of the professing of values. It's not only definition, it's also living by the values, which is a problem. And then the third problem I would like to underline, which hopefully will help us to connect the videos, that concerns the ability of the European Union, or rather the lack thereof, to instill the values in the hearts and minds of the politicians who are responsible for the countries, for the member states of the European Union. So when we see disturbing images from Slovenia, from Hungary, from the Baltic states, people were parading in SS uniforms as well in the European Union. So it's not only Titoist parties, it depends on the member state. The European Union generally has done nothing. And when it speaks up, usually the results are not as visible. Of course, some steps are made, and those are very important, like the cases that the Commission brought against Hungary, for instance. Those are victories, but sometimes those appear as victories, because when the Commission claims victory, this victory can be based on human rights ideology rather than rule of law thinking. This is what we've seen with the retirement of judges, for instance. So we can return to that in the discussion, but at this point I would like to conclude by saying that the EU is genuinely facing these three problems. It has never identified the values with clarity, rather it claimed that it shares them, or we share them, with Azerbaijan, the Palestinian Authority, and countries like this. It has never lived by the values. That's why we had Bosnia, that's why now the European Union is giving up Ukraine, that's why we don't have clear foreign policy and we don't care about peace outside of our borders. We don't have any possibility to promote the values outside of what the member states actually are. And then the European Union has no capacity whatsoever to live by the values and to ensure that those values are respected by the member states.
Thank you, Dmitry. Yeah, so as I already announced in the beginning, I would invite you to reflect on the idea of Europeanization, of creating sort of a normal European state. What do you make of these three videos in view of your specific topic?
I think, well, first of all, I'd like to thank, this is so deeply engaging, forget to thank for the invitation. And I think it's fair to say to the audience that I revealed my reluctance in the beginning to participate, because I thought that rule of law is such it's a topic that's everywhere and nowhere, and I felt can contribute with something and nothing really in particular, and especially then I saw we have a great the first speaker is of course much has written a paper. I'm not sure if it has been distributed, but anyway, I had this reluctance, and then I started doing the readings, which confirmed that the way I felt was actually right. That this is that rule of law is everywhere and nowhere, precisely because it's meant to be a principle, a value, and the concept that really underlines much of the legal work, of legal scholarship, of legal practice, and I think of any really field in our lives. But at the same time, it lacks the specificity and tangibility, or it lacks indicators, it lacks the specificity that Dimitri talked about, because it is it's deeply linked to the principles of justice and fairness, which we know are meant to be horizons, are meant to be distant values, which are meant to remain sort of vague and abstract. And now back to your question. I think these 3 videos tell the essence of what I meant to expose, and this is the political aspect of the rule of law. Because very often, especially in legal texts, rule of law is debated, but very rarely I think it's so precisely linked and visibly linked to the political and also the politics. And this is the aspect that I wanted to expose in my short contribution. I want to highlight that whenever we think or when we hear the rule of law, we should think of the politics and of the political aspect of it. And I think it couldn't have been better than showing these videos. And showing how lawyers sometimes, or they generally tend to get excited by what law can do, but they forget, I think, to think of the limits often of what it can do. And this whole idea of promoting rule of law in the EU, I think lawyers tend to think that it will improve our lives, and I think we buy into this idea as well. And I think this is where Slovenia's experience comes in. 10 years ago when we were thinking, or even 13 years ago when we were thinking about entering this club, the expectations of everyone in Slovenia, probably very openly me included, were great. We thought that the process that hasn't been finished, the transition process, will be finished in the course of the next year, because the European Union will help us, and because the rule of law has such a power. And now, 10 years on this occasion, I think we're faced with a situation where very little has changed. In fact, what has changed very often has been to the worse. So today we live in Slovenia that's quite distant and remote from the idea that we might have had back then, which is of a democratic state, a state that's governed by the rule of law, and of a state that's really normal. We lack some of the most basic aspects and elements that would qualify us as a normal state. So we tend to compare it with Hungary, which we always thought so, but that can't be. We have we hardly can speak of a plural media system, we can hardly speak of a plural civil society, and we can hardly speak of a plural educational space. And I think these are really structural deficiencies, which have historical and cultural roots, and I think they're much more responsible for the weakness of the rule of law than a pressure from outside. So more law and deeper legal involvement won't help us until we start we as a society until we start solving these issues by other means, and that's mostly and primarily by social, by taking on new social responsibilities and new ways of thinking. And I think now I'm really getting to the thesis that I will steal open from Matej, or I'm not stealing it anymore. He's much more of a, he has dealt with these issues in, I think, much deeper way than I'm able to. But I think it's very appropriate that I summarize his thesis, which is that the diagnosis of crisis of the rule of law is wrong at this point, and I can fully subscribe to the view that we can't speak of a crisis because we never had rule of law in India, and so that the whole process needs to be reoriented into, in a number of ways really, but particularly by providing space for a creative and responsible individual, and an individual that's capable and willing to co-create the public space, rather than rely and continuously rely on this invisible hand of the government or the invisible hand of the others. So we need to really empower the individual, and that's the social realities aspect of the rule of law that I think I wanted to expose. And if I have mentioned someone else's idea, I don't want to conclude on this note, but I will conclude with an observation that I think hasn't been at least written by Matej, but probably is observed by a lot of people, and that's that EU citizens and Slovenians included are paradoxically very patient with this project. So the project continuously fails, the project of the rule of law, and yet we still trust, we still have this belief that somehow in the long run it will work. And I think from the point of view of a legal scholar, of someone that spends a lot of time thinking about the nature of law, that of course to me is fascinating, because it shows that exactly when law promises the most appealing normative horizon for all citizens, and it offers to protect fundamental rights, it turns this ideal into a very into a program that transpires the political. And so it seems to me that the law, of course, tries to resolve, is offering more of itself, but at the same time sort of biting its own power. So in a way, the metaphor that I am offering to you is of a snake that's biting its own tail, and maybe this is not something this is not something that's obvious in our everyday lives, but it's a way in which I'm inviting you to think about the rule of law, which I think will urge you to think about the politics that is deeply enshrined in this concept.
Thank you very much for this excellent, also precise and thought-provoking talk. Now, Jack, it's your turn. As I said, from the democratic perspective, right? You ran the elections to the Slovenian Parliament. You're running now the elections to the European Parliament. So, what do you make of all these three videos, and maybe you can also relate to what your predecessors already said?
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with the conclusion of my predecessor. I think the situation is even worse. Not only that Slovenian citizens, despite failure after failure in the law atmosphere, are expecting that at the end everything will be fine and there is always a bright future. It's the same with the, let's say, political forces or parties there are the bodies of the democratization process. Every time, every election in Slovenia, we have new parties that wins or get a good result. After a year or two, people are dissatisfied, but again, next election they vote for the new political offer. I'm very happy that I can start from a standpoint you gave at the beginning, that I'm a political bias, so I can say that I'm a complete pro-European. I had the luxury to work for the European Parliament from 2003 to 2006, and longer I was working for the European Parliament, more Eurosceptical I was becoming. And when turning back to Slovenia, more pro-European I'm becoming. Because now I have two different pictures of how policy works nowadays, and I can compare both standards. The European Union is not a heaven. I mean, bad governments or the countries with bad governments very often takes Brussels to blame for their failures, and it's a very catchy argument that ordinary citizens are buying, especially Slovenians, because we were taught to blame Belgrade, and this came into our blood, and now it's so easy to understand that let's blame Brussels. Even though the Brussels is the last, I would say, last resort or last savior or safeguard of our European, let's say, democratic standard. I mean, not Brussels was the one that dig the hole in our banking system, and not Brussels was the one to not save our judicial system, and not Brussels was the one to make all political problems we are facing. Brussels is the only one that have a final, let's say, anchor or a benchmark to whom we might compare ourselves. European Union is what you expect from European Union. For example, Guy Verhofstadt is talking about the United States of Europe. He thinks that EU should be almighty, and that's why he's always disappointed about the track or the direction that EU is going. So at one side we have these pro-Europeans that think that Europeans should be like a state, but at the same time, when you the same person ask, would you quit your language in order to speak only in English? No, not a way. I mean, this is multilingualism. We should respect our cultural difference. We shouldn't put more powers on EU. So there's a kind of clash of interest. On the one side, you would like to have an almighty Europe, but at the second time, you wouldn't leave anything more on the EU. So if this is the realism, political realism, then you shouldn't blame EU for what is it now. You should use the European Union as a tool to achieve what you want. For example, if we want to have a cheap money, we could invite not the Troika but ESM, but we didn't. We went for a financial market and took 4 or 5 times more expensive financial means to, let's say, still maintain the same level of social coherence of the state. When I started to work in EPP group as a press advisor, and this would be my reference to the first movie, we were talking about how to promote EU in each member state. There were 10 persons from each member state that were employed on a first glance after Copenhagen decision of the European Council to enlarge to 10 new countries, so January 2003. And we had the images of countries. And I still remember very vividly that the Polish press advisor gave the pictures of an old lady with chickens. So that was the damn image of Poland. And when we were looking today, the movie, I mean, Poland is a country in a way of success. Look what they've done in 10 years. In only 10 years of being members of the European Union. Okay, we had a Polish plumber that flooding Ireland, in United Kingdom, on Sweden, and all the other member states. They opened their borders. They were, like a driving force. And then, after 2 or 3 years, they came back and they started to build their country at home. This is the only member state of the European Union with not a single year of GDP drop. While, in the contrast, we Slovenian, we always thought that we are kind of aristocratic, we are more valued than Polish plumbers. We did nothing, not a structural reform. Slowly, but slowly, when our standard was, lowering, we started to blame Brussels. And I was listening, just driving here, the discussion on the national radio about the candidates of the European Parliament, for the European Parliament. I mean, such a bitter bunch of candidates talking about the EU like a union that is destroying our social welfare state. And only they are needed to be elected in order to preserve Europe. I mean, how can a candidate for the European Parliament speak like that? Either he doesn't have a clue what the European Union is, or he's just, joking or don't respect at all the electorate. And I think it's the second reason why they're talking about this. Regarding the second movie, it shows the strength of the media. I mean, I have many friends in Hungary. They have now the second Orban's, or this is already the fourth Orban's government, but the second consecutive government. And one shall say that Orban took the power after 2 mandates of socialists that completely destroyed Hungary. Hungary was on the eve of the International Monetary Fund entering with 20 billion of euros money injection when Orban took the power, and he did everything in order to get rid of International Monetary Fund long before the mandate expired. And he was elected again with a higher result, higher I would say, majority in the parliament. And amazingly, they were capable to cut the number of deputies in their parliament for 1/3. Imagine that we in Slovenia would be capable of doing like this. And yet, Hungary is in Slovenia always criticized like suppressing media or breach the standard of human rights or breach the standard of, let's say, journalist right. At the same time, when, for example, our higher court confirmed or sent to jail the leader of the opposition, not by the decision of the evidence, but the circumstantial evidence, or how you say this, conjecture thing like this. Conjecture, yeah? So, I mean, this is I think more the question we should talk about Slovenia than Hungary, but I would rather, I more frequently see the discussion about the breaching of human rights in Hungary. The third movie was about how we promote this democratic socialism, or how we think about past times. It was really something great. But again, I mean, those were the days when we sat into our cars and go by the border and buy milk or toilet paper in Austria. I mean, there should be some, comparison that would remain in our mind to see that not everything so bright was then time. But yet, there's a bit of improvement. This was the picture of 2013. Stojice feast, while a year later there was not a prime minister, not a president of republic, and not a president of constitutional court, and the audience shrink by 3 times. So I'm still positive and I'm still optimist, and I think, as I said, we should not expect too much of the system. We should use the system in order that we benefit from the system.
Okay, so now we've done the first round. Maybe I would invite you now, if you want to react to what the other panelists just said. John, do you report this? Go ahead.
Well, in the literature, is blaming Brussels as one of the most important it's an added value that Brussels provides us with, because it's called the scapegoating function of the European politics. Because if there is something that is difficult to sell to your voters that will improve your country, and what you do, you usually blame Brussels and go forward. So this is something that definitely helps us develop. About Hungary, I would unfortunately disagree with you, because you need to look at all the array of Fidesz deeds. So cutting the number of deputies in parliament should be taken together with gerrymandering the districts, taken together with rewriting election laws, taken together with driving opposition-minded people outside of the country, taken together with interesting ways of redistributing European money, etc., 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 etc. It's a profoundly corrupt country which is now captured by one party, and that party will remain in power only because of the laws it has written. It has nothing to do with the will of the people. So we should be absolutely clear about that. It's a dangerous example, which is too dodgy to take it as something positive.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm struggling with the very my sort of normative departure, or my treatment of rule of law as a normative concept, and an account that was very down to earth, and I think, and also the films. So I'm finding my way through. So if you want to go first.
My point was that, for example, Slovenia should mainly focus on our problems, and I'm really pretty sure that Slovenia is, if we talk about the corruption, at the very same or even higher level than Hungary. But we have a good reputation of being good pupils, so everything was until now covered by the carpet or hidden beneath the carpet, and in a way, this is the mentality we are still prolonging. And for example, to go back to the question about let's say media suppressing, we had the same problem as, let's say, the movie that was shown there during our EU presidency, where 571 journalists signed a petition sending all abroad that we are suppressing media. While at the same time, the government had an ownership only of the Slovenska tiskovna agencija and national broadcaster. And this was such a hassle that, made a worldwide recognition in the eve of Slovenian new presidency. It damaged our do you really suppress the media? And my mistake then was that I was replying to such a question, because when this is becomes a repetition, if you involve yourself in such a discussion, then you're already accepting the guilt, because you are explaining that it's not true. And of course the media are very, like, they are buddies all around the Europe, and they tend to believe themselves. But it's funny thing that only during the left-wing government, some medias were cut, or some eminent, prominent journalists lost their job, and there was no petition like this. So I always look such stories with a great skepticism, because I know how easy it is to evolve the story in the media sphere. And one shall be aware that in Slovenia we really do have a problem with our media sphere. This is the fourth leg of the power, and in order to normalize our country, there should be some changes taken. Well, in the judiciary.
Sure. Let me jump in at this point, because what you're raising is it's an interesting and actually very hard issue that we already discussed this morning at the law school in Ljubljana, and that is, the problem of the so-called transboundary understanding, right? So when this I chose the CNN video deliberately because it's, to a certain extent, it's very frank, because it's saying the Fidesz government has threatened the international capital interests. So now it's making a big fuss, right? Whereas since at the same time, as Dimitri yesterday during a pint rightly noted, there is nothing about Slovenia. Slovenia is not in the news, right? Another question is how to communicate this. Because, for example, you have a authoritarian system in Hungary. It's a right authoritarian system. And let's say, for the sake of the argument, you have an authoritarian system in Slovenia, which is a leftist authoritarian system. And now you bring this on the European level, and you have partisan views, right? And you have intellectuals and academics that are also, they have normative takes on it, right? And of course, those who have partisan views who are running on the EPP ticket, they would, in a sense, try to defend the Orban. And the other way around, those who are running on the socialist ticket, they would defend the authoritarian regime in Slovenia. And of course, then you have the intellectuals, the academics, who are also not clean slates, and they also come with their own positions. Now, if, for the sake of the argument, we say that both countries are, in a sense, constitutionally captured by certain elites, how do we get to sort of an agreement that that's actually the case? Especially because, when you're making your case in this question, I understand it completely, whereas Dimitri, who's an outsider, he doesn't have a clue what the 571 journalists are, right? And what they wrote and how the Slovenian epistemic community works. And at the same time, as you said this morning, all these affect the European Union is just interwoven. Whatever happens in Hungary, it affects also Slovenia, it affects Bosnia, etc., etc. So how do to cross this? It's a partisan divide, it's an epistemic divide, it's an ideological divide, it's normative divide, it's the divide which has to do with the situatedness in particular fields and political spheres, right? So that we don't, on the basis of our own inbuilt normative takes, we're bound to downplay something and to center something else. Whereas we all agree here, if we're good-minded people, we're good fellow citizens, that there are real problems at stake and how to solve them. So, somebody want to react to that?
Yes, I think it goes actually a step back. I was slightly disturbed by this very pragmatic idea that we should just take from the system, we should sort of benefit or take advantage of the system. And I'm sure this is not the only message that I'm sure there's probably other sides to it. But I think, and maybe this is where I come back to what you were saying, I think I think one of the ways is really taking the continuous political process of the European Union decision-making seriously. So if we, yes, take the advantage of the system, so as to benefit us, I think the other side of this argument is to say that we should also actively participate in co-shaping it and shaping what it stands for in every situation that is encountered. So yes, and then I think only by doing so we get to sort of a case-by-case treatment and examination of what's happening, and I think then we can judge the situation in Hungary in the same way or by the same principles that we judge the situation in Slovenia. So when that doesn't mean that we're not being loyal to our principles, but it means that we continuously think about what the values are and their abstract norms, and what the political stakes are and what the particular situations require us to think about.
I don't find it troubling at all to benefit from what we created ourselves to benefit from. So, what was the problem? What was the problem with that? I actually fully agree with you. I think that the European Union is there for all the member states to benefit from. And then, if there is something that we dislike about it, we citizens, we member states, then we need to ensure that this is changed. The trouble is that, as Martin has rightly pointed out, our understandings can be very different. And then what is understood by certain circles. And in France or in Belgium, I'm thinking about Marine Le Pen, who traveled to Moscow to congratulate Putin with enlargement of the Russian Federation. Or what is understood as necessary in Hungary might be very different from what is the general feeling. So if you are an outsider, if you are an outlier, then obviously you're facing all the toughness of what is there to help you, because help means precisely destroying you. And that's the great added value of the European Union. And then the question, if I may paraphrase your question, then your question is basically when do we need to destroy someone, to allow the EU to destroy some seeds of nuisance, disruption, and illegality that start growing in our countries. And this is a very easy way. There are plenty of ways to look at it, and you can entrust the Commission with doing that. I think it will be a profound result, a resounding failure, because the Commission has already prepared all these countries for accession. We see what the results are. Namely, I wouldn't trust it again. We can create some new institution. The proposals about it, which would be impartial and which would take all the party interests on board to ensure that people from the same party group as the troublemaker will not be always standing on the side of the troublemaking group, thereby preventing any kind of help from being extended to that country. Or we can outsource the whole thing. We have a sound tradition in the Council of Europe. We have the Venice Commission for Democracy Through Law. We have plenty of expert bodies all around. We can organize the Fundamental Rights Agency to do something about it. So then, if we outsource it to the Venice Commission, then the issue would be assessed in the most impartial way, and then we'll get a detailed report about who is captured and who is not. The trouble is, of course, plenty of people will be claiming the Commission is biased, etc., etc., etc. The Commission can be biased, but it's not in the majority of cases. So there are plenty of ways to deal with this.
Is it, in the second question was, is it possible to communicate specifically, deeply entrenched, deeply seated, right, instituted national pathologies across borders, so to make them understood by somebody who's an outsider, right? What would you say? Because in order to undo the state capture in your country, if the internal forces are not strong enough to do it, right? You must have to find allies outside, and you have to communicate your case persuasively, right?
I mean, I think that each nation should have an enshrined, desire to live better. So to develop And the essence for this, or the main tool, is the rule of law. That was, like the essence of today's discussion. The problem is when the country or the political elite deviate from this main, ideal. So in Slovenia, there's always a discussion, futile discussion about democratic socialism. Like this is something now that it's the future of our country. So, if I understand correctly, as we are the member of the European Union, in case this scenario is becoming a fact, that the next election, the democratic socialism is the main ideology, that only means that in a feasible future we will go to buy milkas and toilet paper in Austria. There's a huge difference because there won't be a border, as we are a member state. So, in that sense, I say that it's a huge importance of media that puts enough or reliable information in behind or in front of each active citizen to grasp, to see what is good for the sake of the state. Not not demagogical political discussion, but the facts. And as I said, the common value of European Union, the common ideas and ideals that brought first 6 and then now up to 28 member states together is a very good start. And it brought some very great features and results of the European Union. But this is a never-ending process. But as I said, the country should be based on a value and should have a clear mind of what they want to have out from the state. For me, belonging to EPP family is that the state must give me an equal opportunity and there is an equal measure for everyone. While my, let's say, socialist compatriot thinks that he ought to get everything from state. And this is the main difference what we politically are trying to present. As long as there is a fair competition and you, the voter, has enough information to decide upon what you think is important for you, then the country will prosper. But at the very same day when the information flow, or the information flow will start to lean on one or the other side, the nation has a problem. And as we have a history of 70 years of this filtrated information that leave some consequences, we ought to be even more prudent of this fact. And the rule of law is the main feature or the main tool to bring back our nation to the, let's say, European standard values and normal thinking of the European country.
Thanks. It's a good future for lawyers. There's such a trust in the rule of law.
And that's why I was so happy when I heard that how you translate Mlado Crowley.
Young lawyers.
Young lawyers.
There's you said there's a bright future for lawyers.
That was cynical remark.
Sure, but I think it's I like the way you phrased it, because I think that's what I took as being the essence of what's at stake here. Precisely as I said, what I said before, I'm sitting between someone who is, I think, openly political, and someone, or at least maybe I'm so influenced by the paper that I read, which was dealing, and I will say just shortly, about how we can. Do you want to say two words? So the paper that Dimitri wrote, or it's a draft at this stage, was looking at ways of enhancing the rule of law through basis of the European, through existing treaty basis. And so, the question that you now said, the bright future for lawyers, is, I would like to maybe even pose it to the audience, is there a bright future for the lawyers? Because I think at the moment, the large majority of the discussion we just had was pointing to just the discussion about rule of law is imbued with politics. Everything is about politics. How much law there is even in this discussion. So we have certain treaties, we have European values, they are written, they're written in our constitutional documents, but is this really, does it have to do anything with law? Or is it, what's the threshold, and isn't that expanding the sphere of lawyers? Isn't that just, if you want to see it and frame it as a legal question, isn't that just being too obnoxious of the reality that's largely political?
Again, I'm going to use the same metaphor I used this morning, and borrowing from Joseph Wilder. Democracy of wild people will be wild, it won't be democracy, and the rule of law of wild people will also won't be rule of law. And it is according to Hart, it is the institutional actors and authority lawyers and judges who are supposed to be the backbone of the rule of law. If they don't do their job, there will be no rule of law. It will be just on the paper, right? And that's what we are. That's my own moment of input on this discussion. That's what we are witnessing in Slovenia. I mean, we have all these formal declarations of all sorts of values and constitutional principles, but they are just not translated into practice, because those who are perforce, those who are obliged as a matter of their professional integrity to translate them into practice don't do it. And so we have a discrepancy between the ought and the is, and the ought is in the blue skies, and the is in the deep political, economic, and the legal crisis. But maybe we've said maybe enough at this point. I'm sure the audience has come also to raise some questions. Welcome.
Thank you for the great talks and what you've made. Just some comments and questions. First for Nea. You mentioned that no matter how many times the process of establishing rule of law fails, people still have some belief or trust. I'm wondering if those are really the best words to use. I mean, at one hand, you can look at the polls about the level of trust in the institution or in politicians, and they're really low. So perhaps there's some other non-cognitive attitude that it's not rational, cannot be equated with trust or belief or something like that. It's just like a atonement to this. And for Roger, what you said, I was also a bit disturbed by the use of your words. Dimitri spoke about what's wrong with benefiting, but your words were we should use EU as a tool. But for me, this somehow transgresses this instrumentalization of EU. On the one hand, we like EU values and etc. On the other hand, it just represents a tool for us. Yeah. But the tool presupposes a goal. And then maybe you should just renounce the talk about EU values, just talk about national values. I'm okay with that, just say it. In this framework, this is what this is a tool. You have a hammer. It's very instrumental for hitting nails, not much else. And it's the same with this, the phrasing is a bit bothersome.
And you have to take into account that we have a philosopher here, right? So we have a communication between different worlds. And so far I think the entire debate has been very coherent, even though we have very different individuals with very different languages and discourses and epistemes. So you might be responding.
I think I'll be very short. It's interesting because what I said, which is something like no matter how many times the project fails, people still have trust in it. And when I said that, I meant of the EU project of promotion of the rule of law, But when you said it back to me, I saw how thinking of the same question in the framework of Slovenian institution, I think you're right. I think the levels of trust in Slovenian institutions are incredibly low, but there is a discrepancy between the trust in European institutions, and that's what I wanted to emphasize. That I think, despite our disappointment with what Europe has brought to us in 10 years, I think that average Slovenian probably still thinks, and I think this reflects, this has been reflected in what we said, we still see this as a horizon and something that we should strive for, not to give up. So when I really was meaning just to speak about the EU project.
Or maybe this is something that we, not Europe, actually we have brought onto ourselves, right? So
I actually want to jump in, and I really loved your remarks. I entirely disagree with both of you, I'm afraid. When you mention good life, etc., these are highly charged political, moral, and ethical starting points, which you present as apolitical and normal. So for a communist, good life is something that is radically different from what it is for you. For a profoundly religious person, it is something that is radically different than what it is for you. We need the rule of law to ensure that the conflict between different good lives and different legitimate perspectives of why we live our lives and how get somehow moderated within the realm of law. So that's the rule of law. The rule of law is not living good lives, good life-taking tools from the EU. It's something that is much more tricky and much more useful, actually, much more interesting. And in this sense, the EU's instrumental values has nothing wrong to it. Because when the reference was made to the 6 initial member states, we should remember that they clearly had some instrumental thinking behind what the EU is about, and they brought about some good results for all of us in the end. A good sign of how this works in practice is the introduction of free movement of persons. Because Italy simply wanted to get rid of all the poor and illiterate, starving people in Sicily and elsewhere in the south. And that's why it posed an ultimatum to the other partners to ensure that those people will be let out and will then take up positions, or if we can call it positions, will be employed in the mines in Belgium, and will go to Germany and other places where this kind of labor was needed. So other member states, absolutely opposed to the idea of the free movement of labor, had to concede and had to agree, simply because Italy imposed its idea of good life, which actually didn't overlap with the idea of the good life of the majority of its citizens, should they ever dream of staying at home. It wanted to keep them out. And in the end, it works for all of us. So sometimes, if we think in the long term, it's very difficult to predict how a particular idea of good life can actually serve all of us. But the idea itself is political, and that's why the democracy of white people is vile. Because if you present your own idea of good life as the only reasonable, and there's something that is kind of automatically understood, then this is a very dangerous position. This is exactly what we're trying to fight in Hungary and elsewhere as the European Union. That's why we need the tools. We need to get rid of the people who think in this kind of terms.
But that would cause, what you just said, that would just horrify Slovenian public sphere. Because how is it possible that there are different visions? Because people think differently, there are two words who have different accounts of the world.
Only confrontation can actually bring to the fore different ideologies and different understandings. We can have plenty of people in the same room who have totally different ideas of good life.
So the purpose of any totalitarianism is to reduce those differences, right? And that's respectful. Andrzej?
No, I'll just reiterate the word tool. I mean, I really stand behind this word. There are many states who takes EU like a tool or its legislation and everything, and they do quite well with EU. For example, British rabbit is still valid, and United Kingdom is profiting well by it. The problem is if you don't use this tool, and this is the case of Slovenia, for example, cohesion policy. using the funds. We're leaving more than €1 billion in EU funds due to the fact that we're not capable of using this tool that is offered to us, just to us, and to improve our economy. European Union has a statistic that every euro that invests in cohesion policy in a member state brings 1.3 euros out. This for me is a tool. And it's my mistake as a statesman or a representative of the country that I'm not using what is offered to us. At the same time, I had to rephrase, thank you for your remark. Of course, you are at the same time, evolving new tools in order to get as much as possible of this community. Our mobile phone, cheaper to telephone, because we agreed on this possibility to use EU legislation to force operators to lower their costs. For me, this is a tool, and there are many EU papers that at the end there is a sector toolkit and the exact measures are written.
All right. Any other questions?
Let's not be afraid of failures.
For example, if agriculture policy, more than half of the budget goes for it. If you get money for hammering snails, okay, Brussels is
I'm
paying.
objecting like structural funds or something because they're meant as a tool. I'm just saying that it's not coherent for my standpoint to speak about the EU as a tool, and at the same time try to defend some kind of EU values.
But don't you see this as a restatement of totalitarian ideology, presuming that some kind of community, be it the state, be it the union, is more valuable than what the citizens need it for? This is the kind of logic that has been used by Soviet ideologists that you see in Argentina for a certain time, like the General Pinochet in Chile, in Chile, when you suddenly accuse people of using the state or using the community or using what their political environment provides for their own benefit, rather than honoring it as something that is almost God-given. I think this is exactly our task, to ensure that nobody prays to the state, because it's not only making you fool out of yourself, it's also creating a dangerous precedent. So a tool should be named tool.
Maybe. I meant this more in the, let's say, the Kantian manner, not only as a tool, but always also as a mean.
I understand.
Like you presented, like the Polish success stories. I'm sure there are failures there too. I'm sure there are poor destinies there too, very sad stories. And then you try somehow to defend the Hungarian part of the stories. And
I can be politically biased, you said.
I spoke there here, right? And I understand
this should not be your only argument.
What?
Political bias. Well, you disclose that you can be biased, you should also create
but I have this alibi. Now I understand when you were saying that I'm a pro-European, and at the same time I'm saying that EU is a tool. Of course, but every person is a homo economicus, at least it should be. Otherwise he would die too. So the state should look at being a member of the European Union not to contribute with the values, but rather to grasp what is good from the system, and in the meantime, put his national agenda and enlarge their common value together. But at the same time, the organism would die out if you should only put in and not get anything done.
All right, so if there are other questions, I have a question to wrap it up. It's a bit beyond the context of what we just discussed. So now it is 10 years since the enlargement, right? Would you dare predicting how the European Union will look like in 10 years from now? Is anybody willing to
You know, maybe to add a little bit more sort of as a provocation to this panel. So I was in Berlin a few weeks ago, maybe not already a couple of months ago, and they hosted Sarkozy in Berlin, right next to the Brandenburg gate. It was a magnificent event, and he had this kind of a la France speech, etc., etc. And there he made a very sort of a striking point that the people in the audience applauded in a sense, to my great surprise, even though as an academic I was always been flattering with that idea. But what he was saying was the following. He was saying, bear in mind, nowadays as we speak in 2014, there is no longer one single union. There are at least two unions. He said, there is a union of 28 member states. And this union of 28 member states, this is open for all the possible enlargement we will have. We'll buy Boston, we'll like the Western Balkans, whatever there is. But there is the core of Europe. There is the core of Europe, and that's Eurozone. And that Eurozone is to be developed into the fiscal union, banking union, perfect economic union, and then into the political union. So it was sort of I don't know whether he's a former statesman or somebody who belongs to the past. I think he was invited there in order to reintroduce him into politics again because of the Hollande's failures. So for the first time I really heard from on the European plane from such a politician saying that in a sense the original Europe of 28, the original Europe that we've been incrementally building to the Jean Monnet method, the communitarian method, that method is dead, and that we should just fast forward to the core Europe which is already there. We just need to somehow beef it up and make it good. So do you think that in 10 years on, 10 years from now, we will in fact have Europe of variegated speeds? In a sense, two Europes, something that would be called the federal state or the European something, the European Union, and then the loose alliances of the non-participating member states in the Eurozone, and including Ukraine and other neighboring countries, including the Euro-Mediterranean Union. So we have sort of the core and the conglomerate. Do you think that's... and of course, with two parliaments, right? The parliament for the European Union and the parliament for the Eurozone. And this is not just a fleeting idea, these are the proposals are going in that direction. Which means that maybe Angers will be elected, in 5 years' time, you might be elected in one parliament or both of them. So what would you make of that?
It's an extremely difficult question, and I find
that's
the way you try to, the suggestions you make for the answers are too organized in the sense that I don't see what I do see with my abilities of being a fortune teller is a Europe that doesn't correspond to sort of circles and 1, 2, 3 numbers, but I see a lot of overlapping coalitions that are very, I think, pragmatic, and in a way this has manifested itself and has been a trend so far, because even, I think it's very obvious in some external actions where it's very hard to build, even the core, even the monetary union doesn't act and think the same way. So I find it hard to think of A and B, or 1 and 2, or core and periphery. But I think we might have
France and Germany will lead the core. That's what
true, but they can't disagree, and they will disagree, I think. I think also, for example, from this field that I'm more familiar with, which is environmental politics, you find it very hard to build one voice in negotiations and or external actions. How to, I think, some conflicts that will arise. It's not very clear how countries will respond. But maybe the environmental case, it's quite worth saying, telling it. Germany has a much more clear vision of what it wants with the environmental policy. And it's hard to get France on board and hard to secure its own voice. And, even if it's just environmental, it's not one of the core issues of monetary union and so on. I think the institutions that the core will have are not necessarily the only forces that will unite these core coalitions. And even these core coalitions might break up and sort of form their own alliances in particular matters. So what I see is something very unpredictable for sure. I don't see it. I don't see it becoming a more coherent union. Although I would like to, it makes sense, but I can't quite see that. I don't think the values will be enhanced, and I don't see them coming to the core of the European project.
To comment a bit on it, I mean, there are different phases in development of each entity and even European Union. If since 2004 the enlargement was the main policy, and as it stated, the biggest success of the European Union, it was very visual policy that had a tangible effect, at least for those who are living there and as well for those who accepted the newcomers. Now it's a different period when there has been no such a big step ahead, and Europe should rethink again its legal baseline and let's say the future direction where to go. As long as we have this enhanced cooperation in our institutional arrangement, I don't know why we should stop at number 2 and 2 speeds. You can have all gearbox, 5 gears, even the rear. So it depends on, again, how will the policy develop in the member states, because as we see, if the government change in one state, for example in France, then say it's the end of France-German train. When Mr. Hollande was with a big plan, I will stop and he will change the course of the European Union, but after 2 years he stepped back and he entered again on the Franco-German train. I wonder what will happen when the government in Germany change. So if there will be social democrats, there might be a big change in the course, and other countries might follow as well. We don't know what will happen with Great Britain. I mean, they are heading towards the referendum on membership within the EU. If United Kingdom decided to go out, then we have a different perspective for the European Union. So we have a big challenges ahead, but I think the result will be either one big crisis of the European Union or a small steps towards the, let's say, the cacophony of a common policy, if this is possible. But in
So
European Union, everything is possible.
No sharp division between the core and the rest.
But we are already facing this. I mean, this is a fact. I mean, there will be a free trade zone and a certain part of enhanced cooperation. So if you want to get more, you would be, let's say, interested to enter those inner circles.
But Dimitri, of course, to you this would go, because Dimitri is a great scholar on EU citizenship, right? To you this would cause a number of...
Yeah, well, let's speak about citizenship, but I think this is, what we heard is a profound misconception, because the EU is not political. And this has so far been the strongest point of the EU. The internal market functions no matter who is in charge in Germany, France, or elsewhere. And it has been like this for more than 50 years. So the core of the union still remains the internal market, and this is something that, mind you, cannot be touched by different stages of integration, enhanced cooperation, etc. it's expressly prohibited to have any kind of any enhanced cooperation that will touch the internal market, as long as the internal market stays. With all due respect, I think this is nonsensical to speak about really the different Europes at different speeds, because the core is there. Even if you build on the core a little bit, you cannot really disturb it too far. But of course there is an important but. That we have different member states in the Union. This is something that we have discovered quite recently. There are failed states. There is Greece. There are problematic states. There is Hungary. There is Romania, whatever you want. There are states that function more or less fine. There are hypocritical states, more hypocritical than others, like the UK. It's not news for anyone that the UK cannot leave the European Union and that the referendum will not be about leaving the internal market. You can brand it as you want, but there is a common agreement among the elites in the UK and in the EU as well that no matter how you call it, that the core remains untouched. And this is so much about British opt-outs, etc. But the trouble is that with all this diversity, we don't have so much time. And I'm speaking about the ticking clock because I follow what's going on in Ukraine. We all know about the rise of China. We all know about the American reluctance in putting more assistance in terms of heavy political weight as well as military weight in Europe, which means that actually Europe will have to pull its act together, and it's now do something or perish. So integration should go. If the union wants to be heard and to play any role, then it's not about the EMU and non-EMU. It's about whether you have a functioning European army that will actually defend our values and our borders at least. It's about being able to rebate bullying from other states around Europe and beyond. And it's about projecting your vision of life, if I may borrow the term, all around the world. So I'm not speaking about Europe as a colonizer, I'm not speaking about Europe as a new empire, but I'm speaking about Europe at least responsible for its own defense and for its own well-being. And with the stakes rising, it's absolutely obvious that we cannot rely on the US any longer. So if Europe is a success, we need to rethink integration profoundly. Otherwise, we're speaking about a very sad story. There are plenty of attempts to unify Europe, and the majority of them ended in failure.
Okay, one thing is for sure, this roundtable discussion did end in failure. I, for one, enjoyed it a lot, and hopefully also the audience liked it. Since there haven't been many questions, it shows, it demonstrates that you have been more than clear, and I think it's now time to finish this off, and with a great big thank you.